In this lesson, Know Your Enemy, Understanding is Everything, we're going to learn about depression. We're going to learn about anxiety. The purpose of this course is to help individuals who are introverts who also struggle with anxiety, help them overcome this. And of course, the best way to overcome things is to understand. We fear what we don't understand. Clearly, when we gain some understanding, when we recognize the enemy, we fear it less. This is one of the best ways to help individuals who are struggling with emotional and psychological problems. The problem is we often feel like we're the only ones, nobody understands us, we're all alone. And when we start recognizing that anxiety and depression, and I'm going to talk about anxiety and depression together here because you can't have one without the other. We're going to talk more about that. But when you start recognizing that, wow, a lot of people have it, like 1 out of 3 individuals deal with anxiety. And a lot of the research and work done in mental health is done to help individuals with anxiety and depression. Then this starts to give us hope. And this is a big part of helping us get through this problem. So what we're going to first talk about is what's called the caveman story. This is the origins of anxiety. I'm sure many of you have heard of fight, flight, or freeze. So I want you to think about a caveman. This caveman's left the village. They've sent him off to go bring back, a dinosaur egg or some kind of meat to feed the village. All right. So he's wandering, he's going through, and boom, he comes into this cave. And he thinks, hey, this might be a good place to maybe find some eggs hidden. So the caveman goes in there, looks around, and all of a sudden, out of the corner of his eye, there's this saber-tooth tiger. Tiger's eyeing him. Tiger's growling. What happens? What happens is an automatic response. Our heart rate increases, which then increases our blood flow, which allows our muscles to become more reactive. Our reflexes increase. Our breathing increases. All of this stuff happens to enable us to either fight or flight. So what we do in that situation is we assess the risk and decide, all right, should I fight this? Can I take on this tiger? If so, that's the reaction. Or it's flight. You know what? I can't deal with this situation. I'm going to perish if I stay here. I'm out of here. And then the other one is freeze. This is something that happens as well. When we become overwhelmed, then we stop. Now, going back to this whole primitive aspect, and understand too, this is all part of the amygdala, part of the brain. The primitive, it's like the deep core center of the brain. This comes from a very, very, again, ancestral part of our thinking. So what would this freeze be about? Well, we know some animals actually play dead, right? How many of us were taught maybe when we were younger, if you ever run into a bear, play dead. So I think this is where this freeze comes from in a very primitive way. So understand that when we react to a situation that we feel threatened by, we go into that fight, flight, or freeze, a very automatic, biological, inbred in our DNA reaction. So what happens? What is anxiety? Okay. This is what happens is this creates anxiety. So we have been coded, we have been raised as a culture and as a society to assess risk. This is what anxiety is. And it's overly assessing the risk. Now going back to the caveman, right? We know that there truly was a threat. Nowadays, we don't have that same physical threat. But just like the caveman who was going out to provide, right? He had to bring back that dinosaur egg for his village. Otherwise, they weren't going to survive. Well, if you think about it, if you don't perform at work, you don't pass that test, if you are struggling with physical health, so forth and so on, things that seem vital to our existence, we get this response. fight, flight, or freeze, which very much goes to the core of protection and safety. Now, what we also do is we recognize that we are constantly assessing again for danger. Okay, so we have situations that occur that are out of our control. Now, what happens is if we truly have an anxiety disorder, and this is a stress versus anxiety, if we truly have an anxiety disorder, again, our body is overreacting. The biology of our body is overreacting to a situation that we're not going to die from. This is anxiety. Stress is simply the thing that gets us up in the morning, gets us going. If we didn't deal with stress, which this is just one way of kind of saying anxiety light, saying stress, then we wouldn't be productive. Okay, so stress is good. A portion of anxiety is good. We all need some anxiety. Some of you may have heard the term eustress, EU stress. And this is positive stress. This helps us perform. So what's happened, of course, is we have been biologically encoded to be able to assess danger, assess risk. But if it's not really there, we're overreacting, our body's overreacting, and then we become anxious. So that's what anxiety is. And again, that's what stress is. So let's talk about depression. I like to compare anxiety and depression like tag team wrestlers, all right? Sometimes anxiety's whomping on you, jumping off the ropes, trying to take you out. Other times, it's both of them, anxiety and depression, kind of playing dirty, right? So you go through phases, and you think about this. When you're depressed, you are that. You're depressed. You're pushed down. You're feeling low energy. Okay, and we'll talk about more of the symptoms of depression, but you're basically not doing as much as you should. It's a lack of emotion, a lack of feeling. Then what happens is you start getting behind at work, at school, relationships suffer, right? And then what happens is that starts making us anxious. We're anxious because we're behind on things that we need to do and accomplish. So then we're anxious for a while. Our cortisone's up. We're just riveting with energy and vibration. So then depression comes and again mellows us out. Neither one are good. It's hard to say which one's worse, but this is kind of why they work with each other. Now let's talk a little bit about what depression is. Depression, as I mentioned, it's not sadness. People often believe, we use this very often in pop culture. We compare sadness to depression. And sadness is actually a feeling, and we can usually put our finger on it. Depression is a lack of feeling. It's feeling flat. It's feeling nothing, not feeling emotion. We, of course, have symptoms, physical symptoms. A person can feel very sick. Their muscles ache. They have a hard time focusing, concentrating. They can become somewhat paranoid if it becomes rather extreme. A person also struggles with sleeping. Both they sleep too much or sleep too little. They also struggle with eating. They may eat too much or eat too little. They no longer have interests, things that they care about. They don't care about that much at all. And they just have a lack of energy. So it's important that you understand what anxiety is and what depression is. So here's a question. What's normal? So in other words, am I just sad? Am I just feeling down? Or am I depressed? Okay. I like to call this the 80-20 split. I think 80% of the time, you should be in a pretty good place, pretty good mood, being productive. Doesn't mean they have to be totally elated and just jumping with joy, but you should feel like, yeah, I'm okay. And then 20% of the time, it's okay to be down. It's okay to be frustrated, overwhelmed, burnt out, okay, depressed, if you will. So this is what I like to coin as the 80-20 split and what we should expect. If you expect more than that, then you set yourself up for failure. And if you're expecting less, you're not living up to your potential. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about anger. Now the reason I'm talking about anger is it's really important to recognize that anger is a default emotion. Now if you see the picture here with the iceberg, all right? You probably all heard the expression, anger is just the tip of the iceberg. Well, what does that mean? That means that there's actually other feelings underneath the anger. But we just express all of those feelings. So be it sadness, panic, fear, shame, guilt, loneliness, frustration, embarrassment, the list goes on. If we hold those feelings underneath and push them down, then they often spring out into anger. And so I want to really emphasize that when we talk about depression, we talk about mood, and somebody's really struggling, it often looks like anger. And this is, more common in males than females, to be a little bit gender biased. But know that if you're experiencing a lot of anger, it's because you're suppressing emotion. And I like to say too that anger is really just depression with vigor. Okay, so I hope this helps you understand what anxiety is, a little bit about what depression is, the difference between anxiety and stress. And so you can start recognizing, okay, this is what I'm fighting. This is what I'm dealing with. This is not me. This is the enemy. Again, understanding is everything, and this will help you overcome some of those fears, okay, and overcome the anxiety. Just understanding this takes away the mystery and gives you hope.